Hello, everyone. Welcome to Deloitte's Debriefs Tax webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Corporate Income Tax and Bold Play series and is titled M&A and COVID-19 Strategy in India, Japan, and Korea, Charting New Horizons in a World of Asymmetric Recovery. My name is Scott Olson, and I'm an M&A tax partner based in the Deloitte Seoul Korea office, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I have three speakers with me today: Justine Carzino, Koichi Hattori, and Rahul Vig. Justine is a senior vice president in our financial advisory group and is based in our Deloitte Tokyo office. Koichi is a tax partner, and he is also based in our Deloitte Tokyo office. And Rahul is a tax partner based in our Deloitte Delhi, India office. You may access our bios on the left side of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I would like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of our webcast console. First, all users are on listen-only mode. If you have any content-related questions, you could submit at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen. We will do our best to respond to your questions during the presentation. Second, all PC users can minimize and maximize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen. If you want to download today's slides and related publications, please go to the Downloads and Links box. On the other hand, mobile device users can view the slides and answer the survey questions on the screen. Thirdly, if you require an attendance record for this event, you can download your CPE certificate by clicking the Request CPE icon at the bottom of the webcast console. Now let me give you a quick overview of the topics we will discuss on today's call. First, we will hear from Justine regarding some of the recent M&A trends, both globally as well as here in Asia Pacific. She'll also go over some of the impacts from the global COVID-19 pandemic. We will then move to our three AP jurisdictions, and we'll get updates on M&A trends and COVID-19 implications from Japan, India, and then finally Korea. Following the speakers, we will have a few minutes for question and answers. We will now take a look at the M&A and related COVID trends within Asia Pacific by turning the time over to Justine. Justine?
Thank you, Scott. Pleased to present to you all today. Overall, we know that the recent M&A trends and volumes in the Asia Pacific region have been significantly impacted by COVID-19, including in Japan, South Korea, and India. On the other hand, while the Asia Pacific region has experienced the pain of COVID-19, it has arguably fared better than other geographies around the world. In looking at the trends, though, we believe that the impact is not only driven by COVID, but additional economic uncertainty that had persevered throughout 2019, including market reactions really, to the growing geopolitical concerns globally and within APAC. As a result of the last 12 months, we know that there will be permanent and some recoverable impacts. We have a couple of key observations that we think will emerge in the APAC economy. Firstly, medium-term change in M&A volumes and valuations, particularly in some sectors impacted by COVID versus others. Overhauled investment strategies of both corporates and financial sponsors. Industry consolidation across really key sectors, which also links into potentially higher amounts of distressed M&A. I will now provide some macroeconomic context into the key geographies under consideration today. The first one is Japan. Japan is a pretty typical outbound M&A market. All the macroeconomic factors that lead to this include low domestic growth, indeed now more than ever as a result of COVID, low financing costs, and significant existing cash reserves. We hope these factors will also stimulate further cross-border activity between Japan and other economies going forward. We believe typical cross-border destinations for Japan will indeed include Southeast Asia. With potential travel bubbles in play, it may be easier to consummate transactions in the APAC region compared to historically typical destinations such as the US and Europe. In terms of Korea, Korea's been championed really for its strong COVID response. However, of course, it is not immune to the APAC impacts on M&A transaction volumes. While domestic M&A continues to dominate, there are strategic sectors of interest for both inbound and outbound investors. India, as we know, is a developing economy and has been a key destination for foreign investment, so a high inbound active region, generating mid to high single-digit GDP growth over the past 5 years. Although significant COVID impact on the population and thus economy will play out in the near to medium term. Having said that, technology is advancing rapidly in India, as is consumer behaviour changing. So there's some really exciting areas of opportunity, from traditional sectors such as infrastructure all the way through to venture capital, e-commerce and IT. I'll now provide some further context into each geography. The Japanese M&A market is highly geared towards outbound opportunities as a result of the high cash reserves, low domestic growth relative to other economies, and low domestic financing costs. Japanese investors typically take a long-term view to M&A and build up their relationships with a counterparty over time, whether that is via strategic contracts, licensing or collaboration agreements, or by gradually increasing minority stakes. We believe this is unlikely to change in the post-COVID world. There are, however, been some examples of very large-scale M&A over the past year, including the recently announced Takeda Healthcare carve-out. There also appears to be increasing interest from activist investors who are stimulating important strategic board-level conversations in Japan. In addition, venture capital, which has historically been a relatively shallow market in Japan, is increasing its role in the Japanese M&A ecosystem as startups become more palatable and families think a little bit more about succession. In South Korea, outbound M&A is typically dominated by industrials and machinery, including machinery manufacturing, transport, logistics, auto, commodities, and hardware. Outbound investment destinations typically include China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and indeed Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. There's been an interesting evolution in the private equity sector in South Korea over the past decade, including movement towards alternative transaction structures, utilization of securities outside typical common equity, including convertible preference shares, redeemable preference shares, and so forth. In terms of inbound investment, we are observing steadiness with continued interest from both private equity and strategic investors into South Korea. And then finally with India, as mentioned earlier, India is a key destination for foreign investment. M&A volumes in recent years have been dominated by the sale of distressed assets as a result of changes to the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Key sectors include financial services, business process outsourcing, and infrastructure, including utilities, with a number of notable deals actually involving Japanese buyers or investors as well. There are also some really exciting tech investors, including interest from global tech companies like Facebook and Google and US-based private equity firms. Mid-market private equity and VC investment is also growing rapidly in India, with particular interest in e-commerce and IT assets. We believe this is likely supported by the rapidly advancing technological capacity and changing consumer landscape. I'll wrap up there and hand back to Scott. We hope this provides you with macroeconomic and M&A context that will frame the tax implications that the team will cover in the following sessions. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Justine. It's certainly interesting that while there are some common themes across the different countries, there also are some differences, particularly in sectors that we're seeing activity depending on the country. So this brings us to our first polling question of the day. So hopefully showing up on everybody's screen. The question is, in light of the global COVID-19 pandemic and related economic impacts and restrictions, would you say that your company's current approach in M&A is which of the following? waiting to see how things play out before restarting M&A. Second choice is seeking to divest of non-core businesses. Third choice, looking for buying opportunities that may arise in the market. Fourth choice is looking at new models such as joint ventures, strategic agreements, or similar arrangements. Fifth choice is no change from pre-COVID strategies, and six is not applicable or don't know. While we're waiting for the results to come in, let's quickly turn to Koichi-san in Tokyo and get his input from the overall impact of COVID-19 in Japan. I mean, other than the obvious disappointing postponement of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, Koichi-san, what other general impacts are you seeing of the pandemic in Japan?
Thank you, Scott. Probably due to the Japanese national character, we tend to be influenced by trends. I mean, is it warm? Is it cool? Because COVID-19 is rather stable in Japan. So television or widespread media are so now interested in the results of the U.S. presidential election. Every day we see top news in Japanese newspapers. Or maybe we are having fun as an entertainment show. And thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Koichi-san. Looks like the results are pretty even, with a slight edge to the waiting to see how things play out on M&A, but still pretty similar, other than seeking of divesting the non-core businesses. That is pretty broad response to the COVID impacts. Okay, let's continue on with Japan. Koichi-san, can you provide us with some additional comments on the more recent M&A trends and practices in Japan?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Scott. First, I will cover Japan M&A overview. Recent trend for Japan inbound and domestic deals, similar to other countries, with trends toward alternative work arrangements, extended social distancing, etc. Due diligence deal process has been slow or on hold. Because of such adverse effects, we can see an increase of business rehabilitation by ADR process due to financial weakness impacted by COVID-19, for example, apparel and retail sectors. However, following this summer, M&As appeared back to become active for Japanese multinationals as well as private equity funds, since COVID-19 situation seems stabilized in Japan. For example, as you can see, the following deal cases recently completed or announced, which show trends in carve-out of non-core businesses by Japanese multinationals. Some were acquired by private equity funds. Also, we see other trends for family-owned business, which are sold with private equity funds for families' business successions. As you may know, in Japan, there are lots of wealthy or high-net-worth families who own their business. However, Japan is aging ever faster. Business owners are getting old and facing in trouble with business succession. Now that private equity funds play a role of succession and provide risk money for future value up. From next slide, I'll briefly touch such inbound M&As, including private equity investments, 2020 tax reform, carve-outs, and family business from Japanese tax insights. Now I'll share typical private equity fund investment structure, a famous 25% exemption rules. Under the current domestic 25% rule, a foreign investor is subject to income tax in Japan on capital gains derived from the sale of shares in a Japanese company if the following conditions are met. The investor owns 25% or more of the company's shares at any time during the preceding 3 years, and the investor sells 5% or more of the company's shares during any one fiscal year. As a common structure, offshore limited partnership is used as an investment vehicle for private equity funds. In that case, such 25% is counted at partnership or aggregated level unless certain exemption conditions apply, as you can see the right-hand side of the slide. One of the merits to use the partnership structure is that they do not need to rely on tax treaty benefit. As you can easily imagine, tax treaty holding company structure may be now questioned and considered unstable for MLI or principal purposes. Historically, a Cayman limited partnership has been more commonly used, but recently looking at other jurisdiction partnerships due to Cayman's blacklist regulations, etc. Investors should be aware of that foreign jurisdiction partnerships need to be analyzed whether they are similar with the Japanese one in nature. This is because generally a Japanese limited partnership is treated as a pass-through for Japanese tax purposes. Cayman limited partnership is also generally treated as pass-through following a court case. However, for example, U.S. Delaware limited partnership is treated as a corporation, also based on the court case. If a partnership is treated as a corporation for Japanese tax purposes, capital gain exemption is not available. Therefore, from structuring point of view, this is so important. Let's move to the next slide, 2020 tax reform, which may have an impact to acquisition structure. Historically, a proposal of pre-closing distribution by Japanese target was beneficial to Japanese seller because dividend received may be exempt, but capital gain from a sale of shares is taxed at the level of the seller. Likely applicable case is as follows. Seller is a Japanese corporate shareholder which owns Target. Following the pre-closing distribution, Target shares are to be sold. Before 2020 tax reform, dividend distributions did not reduce seller's tax basis in Target shares, but fair market value is reduced by the dividend amount, which makes capital gain portion to be reduced. As a result, seller's tax burden was reduced, which means seller could enjoy tax benefits from pre-closing dividend structure. Following 2020 tax reform, now that no benefit is expected, as a current rule, dividend received amount will reduce seller's tax basis in Target shares. As a result, capital gain will be increased compared to before the tax reform. You can see a numerical example in the slides later. There are also so detailed rules as well as various exceptions of such reform which buyers should be aware of, which we recommend you consult your direct contact. Then let's move to another Japan final topic, carve-out structure alternatives. The most common structure for carve-out by Japanese multinationals is conducted by way of a transfer of business asset deal. From buyer's perspective, asset deal may be preferable because of the mainly following reasons. Generally, various risks of target may not be transferred to buyer, including historical tax risks, liabilities, and buyer or acquisition company may recognize step-up tax basis of transferred assets, notably goodwill if recognized, which may be amortized and serve as a future tax shield. Targets should be subject to tax on gain derived from the transfer, but may not be taxed twice. Following dividend distribution to seller may be exempt due to within group. However, different from Japanese multinationals, in case where a family or individually owns Target, such straightforward asset transfer may not be preferable because the following distribution to individual seller may be taxed at the progressive rate of maximum 55%. Then, let's take a look at the alternative carve-out structure in the next slide. Sometimes so-called reverse carve-out structure may be more tax beneficial, especially if seller is an individual. With certain conditions, transfer of A business in the slide to NewCo, owned by seller, may be achieved with tax-free or deferral basis at the level of Target. Following this step, seller will make a share deal in Target, which only has desired assets business to buyer. From seller as individual tax perspectives, this should be much more beneficial because capital gain from the sale of shares is separately taxed at the flat rate of 20.31%. Just it. In such a case, buyer can provide an attractive price offer, which can be useful in auction deals. However, buyer need to figure out from their business perspective if such reverse carve-out acquisition structure would work or not. For example, because of share deal, typical tax due diligence should be conducted to see if there are any historical tax risk exposures. And buyer or target is not able to enjoy step-up tax basis or goodwill recognition, which may have an impact to deal price. Of course, whether reverse carve-outs work or not will depend case-by-case basis, but it is recommended that buyers should consider structure alternatives based on actual facts and circumstances. Scott, thank you, and that's all for Japan.
Thank you, Koichi-san. Very informative. Did not realize the individual tax rate can be as high as 55% in Japan. I guess it makes the proposal to increase the Korean individual rate to near 50% not look so bad. At this point, let's turn some time over to India. Rahul, can you provide some of your thoughts on some of the recent trends and practices you're seeing in India?
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. My name is Rahul Vig. I'm currently a partner with the Deloitte India tax practice, focusing on M&A. Today, I will be discussing the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the Indian economy and the resultant opportunities that have emerged in this new normal. The last 9 months have been highly disruptive for the world economy, and India is no exception. India's GDP was estimated to grow at approximately $2 trillion with a growth rate of 4.2%. However, owing to the pandemic, it is forecasted that the GDP for the year would see a contraction of around 5.9%. According to the World Bank, India has been witnessing a massive slowdown, primarily due to the extended lockdown that has magnified the pre-existing risks. Certain sectors like hospitality, transport, aviation are amongst the worst hit due to the complete shutdown of operations. Factory closures, supply chain disruption, displacement of labor, and a collapse in demand have all contributed to a sharp decline in the growth and output. There is an increased pressure on the financial sector due to the worsening of working capital cycles, introduction of moratoriums on loan repayments, and risk of increased bad loans and restructuring of debt. However, in recent months, we have seen certain sectors outshine and lead the recovery for the economy. Information technology, FMCG and consumer companies, pharma, auto and auto ancillaries are all witnessing a surge in demand, and this has particularly benefited companies that have low debt on their balance sheet. Talking about deal volumes, there has been a decline in deal volumes in India in financial year 20 compared to 19, which saw a large sale of large distressed assets under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. However, the aggregate deal values are higher in financial year 20. Large fundraisers by Reliance for their geo platforms and retail ventures have contributed to these higher deal values. Moving on to the next slide. Let me talk a bit about the challenges at hand and the road to recovery. The imbalance in the demand and supply induced by the pandemic, coupled with the uncertainty around the availability of vaccine, has restricted the ability of corporates to raise debt and has led them to shift focus from growth to cash conservation. Realizing the situation on the ground, the Government of India, with a view to prevent and regulate distressed takeovers and have deeper regulatory insight on investments by countries sharing land border with India, has announced that any fresh foreign direct investment or transfer of shares, including indirect change in beneficial ownership from such countries, would require prior government approval. Further, there has been a suspension on the initiation of insolvency proceedings for defaults post 25th of March 2020 as an important step to protect companies from undue pressure, which could potentially end up hurting jobs, the economic sentiment, and also the financial will of the promoters that have the potential to turn around these companies. This suspension is likely to remain in force till the end of December 20 and may even get extended up to March 2021. Promoters of listed companies holding 25% or more stake can now acquire additional stake of up to 10% instead of the earlier limit of 5% through preferential issue of equity shares without triggering an open offer. This would assist the listed entities to raise additional funds by way of equity for the business needs. For easier access to capital, Indian companies are now allowed to list their securities directly in permissible foreign jurisdictions without having to first list in India. Apart from focus on core business, cost reduction, and calibrated spends on business expansion, corporates are looking to revisit their business structures. Monetization of non-core assets is now being looked at more than ever before. This has resulted in new opportunities for M&A, as certain assets would now be available for sale at more reasonable valuations. Divestment of assets may result in capital gains, and therefore structuring of divestments and carve-outs in a tax-efficient manner would be a key element to maximizing the benefit from such divestment. A combination of defensive and offensive M&A strategy would emerge as companies strive to safeguard existing markets, accelerate recovery, and position themselves to capture unassailable market leadership. Private equity funds and companies with surplus funds and access to capital are on the lookout for reasonably priced deals to possibly expand and diversify. Case in point being Reliance Industries, which is attempting to acquire Future Group's consumer business, mainly the grocery, apparel, and supply chain business, to strengthen its position in the organized retail categories. The deal is estimated to be around $3.3 billion, and this could help Reliance in its deep discount strategy for JioMart and e-commerce ventures, which was launched initially and that competes with the likes of Amazon and Flipkart. Now moving on, another big challenge faced was the disruption in the global supply chain. While in 2019, India's total imports stood at approximately $480 billion, the focus of the government has now been on import substitution and attracting global players to set up manufacturing facilities in India, not only to meet the domestic demand, but to manufacture in India for export as well. This policy shift on the part of the government has, for the time being, created additional pressure on the domestic supply chain, especially for electronic goods and components. Key policy initiatives like Make in India 2.0, which aims to strengthen India's manufacturing sector, and Atmanirbhar Abhiyan have been the cornerstones in helping India become self-reliant. Policy initiatives like reduced corporate tax rate of 15% for newly incorporated entities in the manufacturing sector, liberalized FDI rules, and new production-linked investment schemes aimed at boosting manufacture of mobile phones and specified electronic components was introduced to extend an incentive of 4 to 6% on incremental sales over the base years. These schemes have received positive response from global players who are keen to now set up manufacturing facilities in India. Apart from the policy reforms, the government has announced that all sectors will now be open to private players. A new coherent public sector enterprise policy will be formulated and will define strategic sectors which will have least possible number of PSUs. This can set the tone for increased inbound investments. Moving on to the next slide. Another trend that is now evident and will drive the growth for most businesses in the future is the ability of an enterprise to adopt technology. The pandemic has accelerated the pace of this adoption in most cases. the total lockdown imposed by the Indian government during the initial months of the pandemic led to a greater dependence on internet, providing a boost to remote working tools, e-commerce, and home delivery-based services like digital entertainment and online gaming. The digital transformation was highly accelerated in the midst of the pandemic. Technology-enabled businesses that can help accelerate the growth and market penetration have many takers and command a premium in today's market. The rate at which these startups are becoming unicorns has increased manifold in the last year. Excuse me. Certain businesses like food delivery, e-commerce, grocery, edtech, pharma, and healthcare have been able to capitalize in these times and grown manifold on the back of technology. With a relatively younger and highly educated workforce, India offers a huge potential in the startup space, which is the third largest in the world. The government does realize the potential and importance of having a well-developed startup ecosystem in place and has made several changes in rules for investments in startups to help India become a booming destination for entrepreneurs. Foreign venture capital institutions are now permitted to invest in equity and equity-linked instruments or debt instruments of startups, irrespective of the sector in which the startup is engaged in. Some companies or startups which earlier had steep valuations and have now faced price corrections are now beginning to attract investors. So on the M&A space, buyers and sellers, while negotiating deals, are now expected to focus more on clauses of material adverse effects, force majeure. Buyers or investors may be looking to obtain wider warranties and indemnities covering a large range of risk scenarios resulting from the COVID-19, and the sellers may considering inserting qualifiers to the contracts. Clauses dealing with earnouts or follow-on investment obligations will be negotiated in a more detailed way going forward in this world of uncertain cash flows. To conclude, we realize that the impact of the coronavirus-led recession has been grossly asymmetrical and has hurt businesses and sectors disproportionately, with the small and medium-sized businesses being pushed to the edge of survival. The tech sector received a huge push, and there has been an increased consumer adaptability for digital products. E-commerce, healthcare, life sciences have been the focus sectors amidst the pandemic. Hopes of a vaccine availability could accelerate M&A activities across sectors, especially for the ones that are severely impacted by the pandemic. With the realignment of priorities at policy-making level, not only would there be opportunities for increased localization in manufacturing space, but it is also likely to result in more investment opportunities in the private sector and startup space. With the learnings from this pandemic and opportunities emerging in the new normal, there lies a greater need for detailed due diligence and a tough negotiation to cover potential risks. Thank you. I now hand over back to Scott.
Thank you, Rahul. That's very comprehensive and very helpful. So thank you very much for that detailed presentation. Before we move on to Korea, let's have our second polling question of the day. Question you can see on your screen now is, based on your understanding of the situation in the countries your company operates in, when would you expect your business to return to a more normal operational status? Choices are less than 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 1 to 2 years, longer than 2 years, or unlikely to ever return to pro-COVID business operations. While we're waiting for the results to come in, let's turn quickly to Justine. So I have a quick question, Justine, regarding M&A in Asia Pacific. So we often see in newspaper articles or other comments that the comments around Asia may bounce back quicker from the COVID primarily due to their seemingly better handling of the pandemic here in the region. We also see and hear that there's a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines, particularly by private equity firms, yet to be invested. So with these things in mind, what do you see in the M&A activity in Asia Pacific? Do you see it picking up in the near future, or kind of a slow trickle back?
Yeah, look, I mean, I sure hope so. I think Asia Pacific, as a result of a lot of the travel bubbles, which, you know, these discussions are fairly advanced among a number of the geographies across the Asia Pacific region. Both South Korea and Japan are two key participants in that, including a couple of other Southeast Asian countries. And with that in mind, and the focus on business travel for those travel bubbles, we really hope that that will stimulate further cross-border activity. One thing we need to keep in mind in Asia is that relative to other economies around the world, like North America or Europe, even as a geography generally, face time is relatively important, and particularly important when it comes to really material strategic decisions like M&A that involve counterparties that are external to your company or firm. So that is one thing to keep in mind, that, you know, perhaps relative to other economies, the impact of not being able to be around teams easily in person may impact the kind of near-term recovery in terms of M&A volumes, but we do really hope that those travel bubbles will be able to partially offset that.
Okay, thank you, Justine. That's interesting. Certainly, having face-to-face meetings is an important thing of doing M&A deals in Asia, and certainly here in Korea. Looking at the results of our poll, looks like most people think 6 to 12 months or 1 to 2 years is the expected return to normal. So not too many in the less than 3 months, and a few in the never return to pre-COVID business operations category. So I was curious what the response would be to this one, given the announcement yesterday with Pfizer and the German pharmaceutical company BioNTech and their announcement of positive results from the vaccine. So hopefully we get that and the world can get back to normal soon. This brings us on to Korea. So as many of you are aware, Korea was one of the first countries after China to have to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak. While Korea, for the most part, successfully navigated the initial outbreak and the subsequent small second wave a few months ago, the impact on business and society as a whole has still been substantial. Despite having fairly low case numbers recently, the trend toward alternative work arrangements, such as work from home or alternating schedules or other type schedules, continues to impact many companies. This, along with extended social distancing, has put a pressure on a number of industries, such as the travel and entertainment industry, but also on sectors such as the commercial real estate market. Companies are thinking more strategically about whether they really need the space they once did, or if all or part of their workforce can successfully work from home on a permanent basis, or should they even move some of their operations to a less dense location within the country. So although the impact from COVID-19 on businesses, overall seems to be somewhat muted after the initial crisis period. Unlike some countries, Korea, for the most part, did not close its borders entirely, but rather imposed a mandatory quarantine on all travelers coming into Korea. They've now started to allow some exceptions for business travel quarantines on a case-to-case basis. So one of the fallouts we've seen from the COVID-19 situation is an increase, as indicated by some of the other jurisdictions, in the activity around companies seeking to diverse non-core operations or merely to raise cash for operations or debt obligations that are due. Some major companies in Korea, such as the Doosan Group, have determined to sell certain businesses to fund upcoming debt payments. In other cases, we've seen an increase in willingness for joint ventures or strategic alliances as companies seek to navigate the new world we currently live in, and to take advantage of any potential new opportunities. It is interesting, yet not surprising, that despite the pandemic, and while some countries have relaxed the PE rules, the permanent establishment rules related to travel restrictions, and provided companies with some relief, such relief has been limited in Korea. And the relief that they have provided in Korea tends to be more towards small and medium-sized companies. The interesting thing is we've seen no real decrease in the aggressiveness or frequency of the infamous Korea tax audits. In fact, the Korean Tax Authority issued an unusual press release a few weeks ago where they announced a comprehensive tax audits, including the use of tax raids, of 43 multinational companies operating in Korea. And while the NTS itself obviously did not publicly announce the target companies, the Korean press quickly investigated and published the names of some of the more well-known companies that were currently subject to audits. Through these newly announced and otherwise scheduled tax audits, the NTS continues to challenge the deductibility of intercompany charges such as service fees and royalties. It also continues to closely monitor and review the potential of a deemed permanent establishment or taxable presence in Korea for offshore companies based on their activities performed either by the companies themselves or by agents within Korea. Despite some workers being able to return to their, or the inability of some workers to be able to return to their home countries due to travel restrictions, the Korean tax authorities have provided no formal relief or relaxation of the PE rules related to the extended stays in Korea, the otherwise known as the 183-day rule. We have heard from the Ministry of Finance recently that they've, on a case-by-case basis, worked with taxpayers around this situation, but the tax authority itself has not provided any formal relief. But therefore, companies should continue to monitor their activities in Korea to ensure that they do not inadvertently create an unwanted taxable presence here. Moving on to the next slide. One trend that we regarding Korean investments that we've seen recently is the growing acceptance of the Overseas Investment Vehicle, or OIV regime, both by the investment community at large as well as by the tax authority. Although the OIV regime was adopted a few years ago and was expanded to cover capital gains beginning in 2020, the tax authority had for a few years followed their own interpretation and assessed full withholding taxes on funds located in non-treaty jurisdictions. This led to a number of court cases which were ultimately settled in the favor of the taxpayer by the Korea's Supreme Court. However, with the OIV law changes last year, the Supreme Court cases I just mentioned, as well as just a growing number of filings using the OIV regime, the way forward for fund investments is becoming increasingly clear. For those that may not be familiar with the OIV regime, an OIV is defined as an organization that solicits funds from investors and manages or uses those funds in an investment. Therefore, most funds would qualify as an OIV and hence be eligible for the OIV look-through rules of the OIV regime. Notice this should be the case unless there's a few exceptions on the right-hand side of your screen, unless the fund itself is taxable in the country of its organization or is unwilling or unable to provide information on the ultimate beneficial owners, in which case it would generally be the limited partners within the fund. With this general acceptance of the OIV regime, it has been a little bit easier for funds. They now have an increasing ability to more accurately model some of their tax costs of the investments. In the past, they had to make assumptions whether it would apply or not, but now with this increased acceptance, depending on the makeup and the location of the LP investors, the OIV regime can lead to a dividend withholding rate in the mid-teens and an exit capital gain rate of 5 to 10%, which is compared to the normal 22% withholding tax rates on both dividends and capital gains. So we're seeing a better availability for companies to model their investments in Korea. Moving on to the next slide. For strategic investors or those that are unable to use the OIV regime, Korea continues to focus on the determining if the income recipient is a true beneficial owner of an income stream, whether that stream's dividend, interest, capital gains, etc., for purposes of a treaty. In this regard, they continue to make tax assessments deeming that the recipient is not eligible for tax treaty benefits based on the overall facts and circumstances. And they look at a number of factors. You can see some on your screen now. The ones they look at more frequently is whether or not there was a bona fide business purpose for using the entity which was used to acquire the Korean investment, or to look at the income stream from Korea as to whether it's kept by the recipient or merely passed through to the ultimate investors, otherwise known as a conduit test. They also look at whether the income recipient has sufficient substance to warrant to be deemed the beneficial owner. Other things that they would look at would be whether the entity is liable to tax in their local country, whether there was a intent to avoid taxes in Korea, as well as the entity type, the type of entity that was used to invest in Korea. One thing we should note that Korea finally did deposit their MLI instrument, and it became effective September 1st of this year, which effectively amends 32 of Korea's covered tax treaties. Interesting thing is Korea, while they reserved most of the sections and to not apply within the MLI framework, they did elect to apply Article 7, which is essentially the principal purpose test in determining whether or not a tax treaty benefit is available. As all of you know, this is the principal purpose test can deny the tax benefits or treaty benefits in cases where tax reduction was one of the principal purposes for the structure that was used. Now, this test obviously is only a few months old, and it's unclear how the tax authorities will use this new tool in challenging the applicability of tax treaty benefits. We should note, though, that given the Korean tax authorities' history of aggressive tax collection, it is highly likely that they will attempt to deny treaty benefits where a company cannot show that tax consideration was not one of the principal purposes and why a certain investment vehicle was used. So moving on from equity to a couple other, we do see the equity investment continue to be pretty steadily coming into Korea. But there's also seems to be a desire for additional alternative investments in Korea. Particularly, we've seen data or logistics centers from inquiries from investors, as well as a few in the non-performing loan area or other distressed assets. So while we haven't seen a lot of distressed assets in the market, it's important to note that Korea does have some efficient structures for these type of investments. Looking at the left-hand side of the screen, in the real estate area, again, we've seen a lot of activity in logistics and data centers. The most commonly used structure is through the use of a real estate fund. As shown on the slide, there are two types of real estate funds. The first is a trust structure, which is essentially a transparent entity for Korean tax purposes, where all of the income, including capital gains upon divestiture of the underlying property, are treated as dividends to the trust beneficiaries and eligible for treaty rates. The second alternative is a Korean YH, stands for Yuan Wesa, which is a limited liability company or corporation that provides a dividend paid deduction as long as 90% of the annual profit is distributed to the shareholders. So essentially eliminating the Korean tax on the REF itself. On the right-hand side, you'll see similar to the REF structure. There's an asset-backed security, SPV, can also be used to hold non-performing loans, and those can also be eligible for the 90% dividend paid deduction to essentially eliminate Korean taxes on the SPV itself, leaving only the withholding tax obligation on distributions. So every investment's different, every investor is different. Therefore, it was advisable to consider your different options when coming into the Korean market to come up with the most tax-effective structure in Korea. This brings us to the end of our prepared discussion for the day. Special thanks to Justine and Koichi-san and Rahul for their valuable insight. Now we have a little bit of time to go to the questions and answers that were submitted. So looking at our questions, it looks like we do have a few questions that have come in related to Japan. So let's move to Koichi-san and a couple questions on Japan. The first question is, relating to the 25-5 partnership flow-through structure, do you see any challenges or burdensome tasks to actually implement this structure?
Hi. Yes. Thank you, Scott, and thank you for questions. The one of the notable matter is relating to implementation of 25-5% partnership structure. Is the upon exit of a Japanese portfolio company, instead of a limited partnership or general partner itself, each limited partner who would like to enjoy an exemption benefit is required to file a certain form with the Japanese tax authorities. Practically, a general partner needs to gather and collect relevant information for the sake of each limited partner. So therefore, some investor or limited partner thinks this can be some burdensome, and the fund or general partner itself is taking more time to gather relevant information. And also, the exemption rule is not applicable for general partners carried interest portion, with which a separate structuring may be necessary.
Thank you, Koichi-san. It looks like there's one other quick question on Japan. It says, do you see any other points to be considered for the reverse carve-out structure that you discussed in Japan, other than the tax issues?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for questions. And for reverse carve-out, we see sometimes challenges in case where reverse carve-out businesses have certain licenses or regulated permissions or approvals, which are not easy to replace at new goal. So therefore, sometimes even beneficial or optimal purely from tax perspective. Of course, the commercial and business aspects should be taken into consideration as well, whether reverse carve-out should be workable or not. I see sometimes such matters.
Thank you, Koichi-san. Looks like we do have one clarifying question on India. It says, you touched upon the direct listing of Indian companies in foreign jurisdictions. Can you please elaborate on this? Rahul, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks. So on the overseas listing, as part of the economic relief package, various reforms were announced to improve the ease of doing business in India. And one such reform was to allow companies to list their securities directly on the stock exchanges in foreign jurisdictions. Up till now, if a company in India were to go for listing, it requires mandatorily to first list in India, and after that they can go and list on overseas exchanges. But now with the new rules, which are yet to be promulgated in detail, what has happened is that the option to directly list in a foreign jurisdiction would now be available. There are certain recommendations that have been provided by the Securities and Exchange Board of India, and these recommendations are based on things like a strong anti-money laundering regulation, countries that have strong anti-money laundering regulations, and practically all large stock exchanges around the world are currently being recommended. So exchanges in London Stock Exchange, Singapore, Luxembourg, New York, Japan, Germany, Canada, Hong Kong. Most of the large countries and large exchanges are covered as part of the list. We have to wait and watch how this will pan out ultimately. But we do see a lot of excitement around this, and a lot of companies are looking at this option of directly listing on overseas exchanges. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. It does look like we have a few questions also on Korea. First one that came in is regarding the Korea public announcement of 43 MNCs. Is this announced on the NTS website or elsewhere? It is actually a press release by the Korean Tax Authority, the NTS. It's in Korean, obviously on the Korean website, but anybody that would be interested in a copy of that, happy to provide it in either Korean or English translation. The next question is about the quarantine rules, it looks like. It says, Korea seems to have only a limited number of cases over the past few months. Is there any announcement or any expected relaxation of the 2-week quarantine rules for business travelers? As I mentioned previously, Korea never did really close down flights to Korea, but they imposed the 2-week quarantine. And as I mentioned, they have started some case-to-case exceptions, but Korea is being very conservative or being very careful in how they treat visitors coming to Korea, particularly business visitors, even returning Koreans, where there's tests at the airport. And so right now we have seen nothing formal that would indicate that there's any limitation as to when this policy will go. I should note that they're working on potential travel bubbles, as Justine mentioned, within Asia, China, Japan, and Vietnam being the 3 mentioned most commonly. So hopefully things will settle down in the near future, and we can get travel back a little bit like it was before. And final question, it looks like you indicated there were more OIV findings lately, and the tax authorities seem more inclined to accept them. Does this mean the tax authorities do not challenge these filings? So unfortunately, no. As of now, we haven't seen them actively challenge an OIV claim for beneficial ownership. That doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. As of right now, based on the claims we've seen recently, the tax authorities seem to be focusing more on making sure the correct forms are included and making sure that the certificate of tax residency and such. So it's more of a administrative check than a detailed check of the underlying limited partners treaty benefits at this point. Well, that unfortunately is all the time we have for today. Justine, Koichi-san, Rahul, thank you, and special thanks to all of you who are able to join us today. We would like to encourage you to fill out the short survey that will pop up on your screen momentarily and tell us what you think about today's program. If you joined us late, please note that the presentation will be archived for future viewing. If you feel that others would benefit from this webcast, please share the webcast via the share this icon or have them visit the debriefs website. We will respond to any other questions that come in that were submitted during the webcast within the following weeks. Also, if you think of any other questions later on, please feel free to reach out and ask me or any of our speakers directly. We'll be more than happy to talk to you. Finally, please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast from the Corporate Income Tax and Bold Play series, which will actually take place tomorrow, November 11th, and is titled G20 OECD, the Digital Economy Blueprints on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I think as most as you know, these blueprints were recently, for these 2 important initiatives were recently issued, and the webcast tomorrow will provide some timely information on what may turn out to be one of the largest changes in international taxation in many years. So last, from all of us at Deloitte, thank you very much for your participation in today's webcast. Goodbye.